The moment Charlotte Reed knocked on the door, Jason Miller felt his entire life freeze as she said one sentence that turned silence into accusation. "Time to repay what you owe me." Welcome to Poor Girl's Destiny. Thank you for being here. We hope you are having a wonderful day filled with happiness. And now let us begin this emotional story together. The evening air in a quiet suburban neighborhood felt unusually heavy as Jason Miller opened his front door and found a woman standing there he had not seen in years. A white American female named Charlotte Reed, dressed in a tailored coat, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying something sharp and unforgotten. Behind Jason, inside the modest home, his young son Lucas Miller peeked curiously from the hallway, sensing tension even before words were fully spoken. Jason was a white American single father living a quiet and disciplined life, working hard to raise his child alone after years of struggle, never expecting that his past would return to his doorstep in such a direct and controlled form. Charlotte did not wait for invitation or comfort. She simply stepped closer to the threshold and repeated her presence with authority, as if the years between them had never softened anything at all. Jason tried to understand what she meant, asking carefully what she was talking about. But Charlotte's expression did not change. Only her voice carried a cold certainty that made the moment feel heavier. She said she did not come here to argue. She came because something from the past had never been settled, something she called a debt. And Jason immediately felt a tightening in his chest because he could not remember owing anything that could carry such emotional weight. Lucas slowly walked closer, holding a small toy in his hand, looking up at the unfamiliar woman with innocent curiosity that contrasted sharply with the tension between the adults. Charlotte's eyes briefly shifted toward the child, and for a fraction of a second, something subtle changed in her expression, as if the presence of Lucas triggered a memory she was not fully ready to acknowledge. Jason asked again, more firmly this time, what debt she was referring to, but Charlotte only replied that some debts were not written in money, but in choices, in promises, and in consequences that do not disappear with time. The words landed heavily in the quiet air, making the small home feel suddenly smaller, as if the past itself had entered through that open door. Lucas tugged gently at Jason's sleeve and asked softly who the woman was, but Jason had no answer that felt complete, only uncertainty and a growing sense that this encounter was not random. Charlotte finally stepped inside without waiting for permission, her presence shifting the entire atmosphere of the home as she looked around, as if confirming something she already knew. Jason stood between confusion and defense, trying to understand how a life he had carefully rebuilt could be interrupted so easily by a single arrival. Charlotte then said one final line before the silence deepened again, that she did not come to destroy anything, but to collect what was already owed to her. And in that moment Jason realized this was no ordinary visit, but the beginning of something that would force him to confront a past he had never fully understood or forgotten. The silence inside Jason Miller's home grew heavier after Charlotte Reed stepped past the doorway, as if she already belonged there, while Jason stood frozen between disbelief and concern, trying to understand how a calm suburban evening had turned into something that felt like an unresolved chapter reopening itself. Without warning, Lucas Miller stayed close to his father, watching the woman carefully with quiet curiosity, sensing tension without fully understanding it, while Charlotte moved slowly into the living room and looked around with controlled composure, as if every detail confirmed something only she could see. Jason finally closed the door behind her, his voice careful as he asked her to explain exactly what she meant by debt, but Charlotte did not answer immediately. Instead, she focused on the environment. On the simple furniture, the child's drawings on the refrigerator, and the quiet signs of a life rebuilt from struggle. Jason felt increasingly uneasy, because her silence was not uncertain, it was intentional, as if she was deciding what truth should be revealed first. Charlotte eventually turned back toward him and repeated that she did not come for confusion or misunderstanding. She came because something important had been left unresolved between them in the past. Jason shook his head slightly, insisting he had no memory of owing her anything that could justify this kind of confrontation. But Charlotte's expression remained steady, almost clinical, as if his denial did not change the reality she carried with her. Lucas tugged lightly on Jason's sleeve again and asked if the woman was angry. And Jason knelt down briefly to reassure him that everything was fine. Though his eyes never left Charlotte as he spoke, Charlotte watched this interaction silently, her gaze softening for just a moment when she looked at the child, before returning to Jason with renewed focus, as if the presence of Lucas only strengthened her certainty rather than weakened it. Jason invited her to sit, hoping that conversation might bring clarity, and Charlotte finally agreed, taking a seat across from him with perfect posture that contrasted sharply with the informal warmth of the home. She then calmly stated that she had not spent years remembering this moment just to be ignored or misunderstood, and that what she called a debt was not something he could dismiss by forgetting it. Jason felt frustration building, but controlled it carefully. Asking her again what exactly she believed he had done, Charlotte leaned forward slightly and explained that the debt was not something written in contracts or money transfers, but something formed through trust, decisions, and consequences that had never been properly addressed. Jason listened closely, but still found no connection to what she was describing. Yet the certainty in her voice made him question whether he was missing something from his own past. Lucas sat quietly on the sofa watching both adults, sensing that this conversation carried weight far beyond his understanding. Charlotte's attention shifted briefly to a framed photo on a nearby shelf, and for the first time her composure showed the smallest trace of emotional tension. Before she quickly recovered, Jason noticed this shift and asked her directly if she was confusing him with someone else. But Charlotte responded without hesitation that she had not mistaken anything, and that she had come to the right place, because time does not erase responsibility, it only delays it. The words settled heavily in the room as Jason realized that whatever connection tied them together was not going to be explained easily, and that this unexpected confrontation was only the beginning of a deeper truth that neither of them was fully prepared to face. The tension inside Jason Miller's home continued to deepen as Charlotte Reed remained seated in the living room with absolute calm, as if her presence alone had already rewritten the rules of the space, while Jason tried to maintain composure for the sake of his son Lucas, who still watched quietly from the side. Sensing emotional pressure without understanding its origin, Jason sat across from Charlotte now, his posture more controlled, but his voice still carrying confusion as he asked her to explain why she believed he owed her anything when he had no memory of a transaction, agreement, or moment that could justify such a claim. Charlotte did not respond immediately. Instead, she studied him carefully, as if evaluating whether denial was ignorance or avoidance, and that silence alone made the atmosphere heavier. Lucas shifted slightly closer to Jason, holding onto his father's sleeve again, and Jason gently reassured him that everything would be fine. Though his own uncertainty was becoming harder to conceal, Charlotte finally spoke again, her tone steady and deliberate, saying that the debt she referred to was not something created by paperwork or financial exchange, but something far more personal that involved choices made years ago and consequences that never fully disappeared. Jason frowned, insisting that if something from the past connected them, she needed to be more specific because he could not respond to something he did not remember. Charlotte's gaze remained fixed, and for the first time a subtle trace of emotion appeared beneath her controlled exterior as she mentioned that some actions leave impressions on people even when the person responsible chooses to move forward and forget. Lucas, still unaware of the complexity unfolding, quietly asked Jason if the woman was going to stay for dinner, and the question broke the tension slightly, forcing both adults to briefly acknowledge the innocence in the room. Jason responded softly that they were only talking, while Charlotte's attention briefly softened again toward the child before returning to Jason with renewed focus, as if Lucas represented something important in this unresolved equation. Jason asked Charlotte directly if she had the wrong person or if she was confusing him with someone from her past. But Charlotte answered firmly that she was not mistaken and that the reason she was here was because she had already confirmed everything before arriving. Her words carried certainty that unsettled Jason more than accusation alone could have. Charlotte then stood and walked slowly toward a nearby shelf where a few family photos were displayed, pausing as her eyes settled on one in particular, showing Jason with a younger version of Lucas. And for a brief moment her expression changed in a way Jason could not immediately interpret. Jason noticed the shift and asked what she was looking at, but Charlotte simply said that memories do not always belong only to one person, and that sometimes they return in different forms depending on who survived them. Jason felt a tightening in his chest at that statement, because it suggested a shared history that he still could not access or understand. Lucas returned to sitting quietly, sensing that the conversation had moved into territory far beyond his comprehension, while Charlotte returned to her seat and calmly repeated that she did not come here to argue about memory, but to claim acknowledgement of what had been left unresolved. Jason looked at her for a long moment, realizing that the calm certainty in her voice meant this confrontation was not ending soon, and that whatever past connected them was still buried beneath layers of time, waiting to surface whether he was ready or not. The atmosphere inside Jason Miller's home had shifted into something more fragile and emotionally dense as Charlotte Reed remained seated with unwavering composure, her presence still filling the space, as if she had never left it, while Jason struggled to maintain control over a conversation that felt increasingly detached from anything he could clearly recognize. Lucas Miller sat quietly beside the sofa now, watching the adults with a child's instinctive awareness that something serious was unfolding, even though no one had explained it in simple terms. Jason took a slow breath and asked Charlotte once more to be direct, saying that if she truly believed he owed her something, then she needed to explain exactly what happened, because vague accusations only created confusion. Charlotte looked at him steadily and replied that clarity was not something she could simply provide, because what she was referring to was not a single event, but a sequence of choices and consequences that had stretched across time. Jason shook his head slightly, insisting that he had no memory of any agreement or promise that would justify her words. But Charlotte did not react with frustration, only with a calm certainty that made the situation feel even more unsettling. Lucas suddenly asked if the woman knew his mother, a question innocent in tone but powerful in effect, causing both adults to pause briefly before responding. Charlotte looked at the child for a moment and then back at Jason, her expression softening only slightly as she said that some connections existed even when people chose not to acknowledge them. Jason felt a subtle discomfort rise again, not because of hostility, but because of the implication that there was a shared history he could not access or fully understand. He asked her again if she was certain she had the correct person, and Charlotte answered without hesitation that she had confirmed everything before coming, and that there was no mistake in her decision to appear at his door. Jason stood and walked a few steps toward the window, trying to process the situation logically. But nothing aligned with what he knew of his past life. Charlotte then stood as well and moved toward a shelf displaying family items, her gaze landing again on a photograph that seemed to hold significance. She studied it silently for several seconds before saying quietly that people often underestimate how deeply moments can affect others, even when they are forgotten by the one who caused them. Jason turned back toward her immediately, asking what she meant by that statement, but Charlotte only replied that forgetting does not erase impact, and that some things remain unresolved until they are acknowledged. Lucas, sensing the rising emotional weight, moved closer to Jason again and held onto his hand, grounding him in the present while the conversation around him became increasingly abstract. Charlotte returned to her seat and explained in a steady voice that she did not come to create conflict, but to ensure that something important from the past was no longer ignored. Jason felt a growing pressure in his chest as he realized that her certainty was not based on confusion or misunderstanding, but on conviction rooted in something he had no access to yet. He told her firmly that he could not respond to something he did not remember, and that if she wanted resolution, she would need to provide proof or context. Charlotte remained silent for a moment before responding that truth does not always arrive in full clarity at once, and that sometimes it returns in fragments that force people to reconsider everything they believe they know about themselves. The room fell into a deeper silence after her words as Jason stood between disbelief and uncertainty, realizing that this confrontation was not about a simple accusation, but about a buried history slowly pressing its way back into the present, whether he was ready for it or not. The silence inside Jason Miller's home had become heavier than before as Charlotte Reed remained seated with unwavering calm, her presence no longer feeling like an interruption, but like a fixed point that refused to move, while Jason stood nearby, trying to maintain emotional control for the sake of his son Lucas, who continued watching quietly from the edge of the room, sensing that something important was unfolding even if he could not understand the meaning. Jason finally spoke again in a lower and more controlled tone, asking Charlotte to stop speaking in riddles and to tell him directly what she believed he had done that created this so-called debt. Charlotte studied him for a long moment before answering that what he called riddles were simply the result of time separating cause from consequence, and that not all truths remain visible to the person who created them. Jason tightened his jaw and said that if there was a real connection between them, then she needed to provide something concrete because memory alone could not justify accusations. Charlotte responded calmly that memory was not the issue because consequences exist even when memory fails to preserve their origin. Lucas shifted closer to Jason again and quietly asked if the woman was going to stay long, which briefly softened the tension but did not remove it. Jason gently reassured his son that everything was under control even though his own uncertainty was growing deeper. Charlotte then stood once more and slowly walked toward the shelf where family photographs were displayed, her eyes returning to a specific frame that showed Jason holding Lucas in an earlier year. She looked at it quietly for several seconds before speaking in a softer tone that suggested reflection rather than confrontation, saying that some people move forward without realizing they are carrying unfinished chapters behind them. Jason immediately turned toward her and asked what she meant by unfinished chapters, but Charlotte did not answer directly. Instead, she said that certain moments are not erased by time, only hidden beneath it, waiting for something to bring them back into awareness. Jason felt a growing discomfort, not because of anger, but because of the implication that his entire understanding of his own past might be incomplete. Lucas watched both adults carefully, sensing the emotional weight, even though he could not interpret it fully. Charlotte returned to her seat and said that she did not come to argue about interpretation, but to make sure that what was unresolved would no longer remain ignored. Jason took a slow breath and insisted again that he had no knowledge of any debt or promise that connected them, and that, without clarity, he could not accept responsibility for something unknown. Charlotte nodded slightly, acknowledging his position, but replied that truth does not depend on immediate recognition because some truths arrive slowly and force people to reconsider what they thought was certain. The room fell into a deeper silence after her words as Jason stood between disbelief and growing uncertainty while Lucas reached for his hand again, grounding him in the present moment as Charlotte remained seated calmly, as if she had already said everything necessary for now, leaving the weight of unanswered history suspended in the air between them. The tension inside Jason Miller's home had reached a level of quiet emotional exhaustion as Charlotte Reed remained seated with the same composed certainty she had carried from the beginning, while Jason stood near the center of the room, trying to hold on to logic even as his thoughts became increasingly fragmented by her unwavering claims, and Lucas Miller stayed close to his father, silently absorbing the emotional weight without understanding its origin. Jason finally spoke again in a more controlled but clearly strained tone, asking Charlotte to stop speaking in abstract ideas and to give him something tangible that could explain why she believed he owed her anything from a past he could not remember. Charlotte looked at him steadily and replied that not all truths exist in the form of clear evidence, because some truths are carried emotionally long before they are recognized logically. Jason responded that without clarity, there was no way for him to accept responsibility for something he did not consciously know, and Charlotte answered calmly that consciousness does not define impact because actions remain real even when memory fails to preserve them. Lucas shifted slightly on the couch and asked in a soft voice if the woman was going to stay for a long time, which briefly interrupted the emotional tension and caused Jason to gently reassure him that everything was fine, even though his expression betrayed uncertainty. Charlotte's gaze softened briefly toward Lucas again before returning to Jason as she stood and walked slowly toward a small table near the wall where several personal items were placed, including old photographs and keepsakes. She paused when she reached a framed picture showing Jason with Lucas from earlier years and studied it in silence for several seconds before speaking in a quieter tone that suggested reflection rather than confrontation, saying that time often hides connections rather than removes them. Jason turned immediately and asked her what she meant by connections, and Charlotte replied that certain lives intersect in ways that are not fully understood at the moment they happen, but later become impossible to ignore. Jason felt a tightening in his chest because her words suggested a shared history that he still could not access or identify. Lucas watched both adults carefully, sensing that the conversation had shifted into something deeper than normal explanation. Charlotte returned to her seat and said again that she did not come to argue about interpretation, but to ensure that what remained unresolved would no longer be ignored. Jason exhaled slowly and insisted once more that he could not respond to a claim that lacked any clear reference or memory, and Charlotte acknowledged his position without changing her certainty, stating that truth often arrives in fragments and forces people to reconsider what they thought was settled. The room fell into a long and heavy silence after her words as Jason stood between confusion and growing emotional pressure, while Lucas instinctively moved closer to him and held his hand, grounding him in the present, while Charlotte remained calm and unmoved, as if the conversation had only just begun and whatever she had come to reveal was still waiting beneath the surface of everything that had already been said. The silence inside Jason Miller's home had become heavier than words as Charlotte Reed remained seated with steady composure, her presence no longer feeling like an intrusion but like a fixed truth that refused to be dismissed, while Jason stood nearby struggling to maintain emotional stability as his son Lucas Miller continued observing everything with quiet uncertainty and growing sensitivity to the tension around him. Jason finally spoke again, this time with a more controlled but visibly strained voice, asking Charlotte to stop speaking in abstract concepts and to explain clearly what exactly she believed he had done that created this so-called debt. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment before replying that what he called abstract was simply the reality of consequences that do not always present themselves in a clear or immediate form. Jason shook his head slightly, insisting that without specific details he could not accept responsibility for something outside his awareness. Charlotte responded calmly that awareness is not the same as impact, because actions continue to exist in the lives of others even when the person who caused them no longer remembers. Lucas shifted closer to Jason again and quietly asked if the woman was angry, which momentarily softened the intensity in the room and caused Jason to gently reassure him that everything was only a conversation, even though his expression suggested otherwise. Charlotte's gaze softened briefly toward Lucas once more before returning to Jason as she stood and walked toward a small shelf where several framed photographs and personal items were placed. She paused when she reached a particular photo showing Jason with Lucas from an earlier time and studied it silently for several seconds before speaking in a lower tone that carried reflection rather than confrontation, saying that time often hides the connections between people instead of removing them. Jason immediately turned toward her, asking what kind of connections she was referring to, and Charlotte replied that some encounters do not fully reveal their meaning at the moment they happen, but instead remain hidden until circumstances force them back into awareness. Jason felt a tightening in his chest as her words implied a shared history that he could not access or confirm. Lucas watched both adults carefully, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond normal explanation into something more emotionally complex. Charlotte returned to her seat and repeated calmly that she did not come to argue interpretation, but to ensure that what had been left unresolved would no longer remain ignored. Jason took a slow breath and insisted once more that he could not respond to something he did not remember, and Charlotte acknowledged his position without altering her certainty, stating that truth often returns in fragments that require people to reconsider everything they believed was already settled. The room fell into a deeper silence after her statement as Jason stood between confusion and emotional strain, while Lucas instinctively held on to his father's hand, grounding him in the present, while Charlotte remained composed and unwavering, as if the conversation had only reached its first layer and what she had come to reveal was still waiting beneath everything that had already been spoken. The atmosphere inside Jason Miller's home had become almost motionless as Charlotte Reed remained seated with unwavering calm, her presence no longer feeling like an intrusion but like an unavoidable truth pressing into the space between every breath, while Jason stood nearby struggling to maintain emotional control as his son Lucas Miller continued to observe everything with quiet attention that reflected both innocence and a growing awareness that something important was unfolding beyond his understanding. Jason finally broke the silence again, asking Charlotte in a firm but controlled tone to stop speaking in abstract ideas and to tell him directly what he supposedly owed her and why she believed it had anything to do with his current life. Charlotte looked at him steadily and replied that what he called abstract was simply the way consequences exist when they are not immediately understood by the person who caused them, Jason responded with visible frustration, saying that he could not accept responsibility for something he had no memory of, and Charlotte answered calmly that memory is not required for impact to exist, because lives are often shaped by decisions that are later forgotten by the one who made them. Lucas shifted slightly closer to Jason again and quietly asked if the woman was going to stay angry, which momentarily softened the emotional tension and caused Jason to gently reassure him that everything was just a conversation, even though his eyes remained fixed on Charlotte with uncertainty. Charlotte's expression softened briefly when she looked at Lucas again, before returning her focus to Jason as she stood and walked toward a shelf where several framed photographs were placed. She paused when she reached a particular image showing Jason with Lucas from an earlier time and studied it in silence for several seconds before speaking in a lower tone that carried reflection rather than confrontation, saying that time has a way of hiding connections rather than removing them completely. Jason immediately turned toward her, asking what she meant by connections, and Charlotte replied that some encounters in life do not reveal their meaning at the moment they happen, but instead remain buried until something brings them back into awareness. Jason felt a tightening in his chest as her words suggested a shared history that he could not access or confirm. Lucas watched both adults carefully, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond normal explanation into something emotionally layered and unresolved. Charlotte returned to her seat and repeated that she did not come to argue interpretation, but to ensure that what had been left unresolved would no longer remain ignored. Jason took a slow breath and insisted again that he could not respond to something he did not remember, and Charlotte acknowledged his position without changing her certainty, stating that truth often returns in fragments that force people to reconsider everything they thought was settled. The room fell into a deeper silence after her words, as Jason stood between confusion and emotional strain, while Lucas instinctively held onto his father's hand, grounding him in the present, while Charlotte remained composed and unwavering, as if everything said so far was only the surface layer of something far deeper still waiting to be revealed. The silence inside Jason Miller's home had become so heavy that even the smallest movement felt amplified, as Charlotte Reed remained seated with calm control, her presence no longer appearing as an interruption, but as something inevitable that had already changed the emotional structure of the room, while Jason stood nearby, struggling to maintain stability in his thoughts, and Lucas Miller stayed close to him, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted into something deeper than anything he could understand. Jason finally spoke again in a firm but restrained voice, telling Charlotte that if she truly believed there was a debt between them, then she needed to explain it clearly and without ambiguity, because he could not respond to something that existed only in her interpretation. Charlotte looked at him steadily and replied that what he called interpretation was simply the way truth behaves when it has been ignored for too long. Jason shook his head and said that he had no memory of any event that would justify her claims, and Charlotte answered calmly that memory does not determine reality because consequences remain even when recollection fades. Lucas shifted closer and quietly asked Jason if the woman was going to leave soon, which briefly softened the tension and caused Jason to reassure him in a low voice that everything would be fine, even though his expression remained tense. Charlotte's gaze softened briefly toward Lucas again before she stood and walked once more toward the shelf of photographs, her eyes settling on a frame showing Jason with Lucas from an earlier time. She studied it silently for several seconds before speaking in a quieter tone, saying that time does not erase connections, it only hides them beneath layers of distance. Jason immediately turned and asked her what kind of connections she was referring to, and Charlotte replied that some connections are not meant to be recognized immediately, but instead return when life forces people to confront what they once avoided. Jason felt a tightening in his chest as her words suggested a shared history he could not access or fully understand. Lucas watched both adults carefully, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond explanation into something emotionally unresolved. Charlotte returned to her seat and stated once again that she did not come to debate interpretation, but to ensure that what remained unfinished would no longer be ignored. Jason took a slow breath and repeated that he could not accept responsibility for something he did not remember, and Charlotte acknowledged his position without changing her certainty, saying that truth often arrives in fragments that force people to question everything they believe is already settled. The Room fell into a deeper silence as Jason stood between confusion and emotional strain, while Lucas instinctively held onto his father's hand, grounding him in the present, while Charlotte remained composed and steady, as if everything that had been said so far was only the beginning of a deeper truth waiting beneath the surface. And in that final, suspended moment, none of them moved because the weight of what remained unspoken felt heavier than anything already revealed. Thank you for watching until the end of this video. We truly appreciate your time and support. Please share your thoughts about this emotional story in the comments section below. Do not forget to subscribe to Poor Girl's Destiny for more touching stories and powerful life moments. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next story.